So it's a great pleasure and privilege to be able to talk to Sir Andrew Huxley. May I call you Andrew? Is that all right?
Yes, by all means.
Andrew, when were you born and where?
22nd of November 1917 in Hampstead.
And I always ask about parents, or sometimes even grandparents. In your case, I would like to start with your grandparents, because on one side at least, which I know about, they were extremely distinguished. Can you tell me something about your grandparents, the Huxleys?
Well, T.H. Huxley was my grandfather. I'm sort of disproportionately young to be only a grandson, because my father was married twice and I'm the younger son of the second marriage. Most people knew their grandfathers. I didn't know either of my grandfathers. T.H. Huxley died in 1895, more than 20 years before I was born. And my mother's father, well, she was a Bruce. Well, he worked in the city and then retired and was busy in social affairs. I think was on London County Council. He died in 1908. So I never met either of them.
And then, in a slightly more distant way, I noticed on your family tree, you're related to Matthew Arnold.
Yes. Well, that's a connection rather than a relationship.
Yes.
My father's first wife was a niece of Matthew Arnold. She was a granddaughter of the Thomas Arnold who started rugby school and set the fashion for other schools.
Are you an admirer of Arnold's poetry?
A little bit. I don't read much poetry, but no, I have enjoyed some of it. And, well, he made a published collection of English poetry, which I dip into.
And then, moving down to your parents' generation, can you tell me something about your parents?
Well, my father was Leonard Huxley. He was a literary man, but well, quite knowledgeable about science. He died in 1933, I was only 15, but well,
what sort of character was he? Do you remember what?
Well, very friendly and gentle.
Encouraging to you?
Yes.
And your mother, what sort of person was she?
Well, she was well, extremely good with her hands, and I've to some extent inherited that. And well, she was a widow for a long time. Died in 1994 at the age of 104.
Gosh.
Having been a widow since 1933. But no, she was well, physically very active. My father wrote a short poem to her in which he addressed her as an Oread nymph, as to say, a mountain nymph. Yes, we always took our holidays on the west of Scotland. Well, my mother's father and my mother's father had taken shootings on the west of Scotland from 1880 onwards. And then in, I think, 1902, they bought a holiday house at Connell Ferry on Loch Etive, just a few miles north of Oban, in well, very attractive country. And yes, when I was small, we regularly went there for our summer holidays, which of course were plagued by midges. And then later we took to taking our holidays in April. No midges, sometimes very cold, usually snow on the hills, but we always enjoyed it. And nowadays, well, I only go on holidays when one of my children takes me on holidays, and well, very often that's on the west of Scotland. Yes, this April, one of my daughters took a self-catering house near Loch Torridon, a good bit further north than Oban, and we had a lovely time. I still walk a fair amount, but I don't climb mountains in the way that I used to, or rather it was hill walking. I never went in for rock climbing.
Tell me something also about your mother was your father's second wife. Is
Yes.
that right? And as you mentioned briefly earlier, by his first wife, he had several sons, at least two of whom are internationally known. Can you tell me something about Aldous and Julian?
Well, Julian was just 30 years older than me, Aldous several years younger, so they were more like uncles than like brothers. But we saw them quite often before the war. We were living in Hampstead. Aldous, of course, travelled a lot, but when he was in London, he came to visit us quite often. Both of them very good company in different ways. Julian full of stories, one sort or another, very often laced with impropriety. Aldous always interesting and friendly. Of course, he had very poor eyesight. He had for a time been actually blind and had learnt Braille.
Yes.
Had the one great advantage of reading Braille was that you could read in bed without your hands getting cold.
He wrote a book about it, didn't he, about short sight?
Yes.
I read it. So, do you think either of them influenced your future career in any way? The fact that Julian, for instance, was a very great biologist and zoologist.
I don't think so. I mean, my sort of science has been very different from Julian's. I mean, Julian was essentially an observer, primarily of birds, and interested in their behaviour. Really founded the science of animal behaviour. But I've really had very little interest in, well, the behaviour of living animals. Yes, well, T.H. Huxley wrote a short autobiography in which he says his boyhood ambition was to become an engineer. But he went into medicine because he had a brother-in-law in medicine, and he says the only part of his course that really interested him was physiology, because it is the mechanical engineering of living things. And that's an exact description of my interest in physiology, which has been my main work. But I think engineering is in the family. When I was a boy, my interests were all mechanical, playing with mechanical toys. Had quite a lot of Meccano, which well, it's sold in sets, but my mother did not buy sets for us. She bought the separate parts so that we had to design our own things that we made with them. And railway sets, gauge 0, gauge 1¼ inches, which we put out once a year in the winter holidays. We took over the spare room at our home and had a quite elaborate layout in which I was more interested in the mechanical things. My 2-year-older brother, David, was more interested in organization and so on, and the layout. Yes, I made a number of mechanical things related to the railway. Yes, when I was, I think about 14, my parents gave to my brother and me a metal turning, screw cutting lathe, which I still have. It's in the garage here. And, well, I made a lot of things on it. I had it in my lab when I was doing experimental work, and made quite a lot of my own equipment. And I made quite a number of improvements to the lathe, such as putting scales on its movements, and fitting an arrangement for automatic feed in the cross direction as well as the forward direction. And like virtually all lathes, it had the clutch for the lead screw, the screw that moves the tool when you're cutting a thread, but the clutch for it was on the same shaft as the lead screw. Well, that meant that if you cut a thread, you have to take several cuts to get it deep enough, and when you went back to take another cut, it wouldn't fit into the existing groove unless the thread you were cutting had a pitch that was some exact fraction of the pitch of the lead screw, 10 to the inch. And I therefore made another clutch on the back end of the shaft that carries the work that you're turning, so that when it was declutched and reclutched again after moving your tool back to take a deeper cut, it would automatically engage after an exact number of turns. So you'd deepen the cut, whatever the pitch.
Was this patented? Did you?
No, I think it's sort of so obvious that it couldn't be patented.
That sounds a very good idea. You mentioned this was at about the age of 14 that you were given this. If we could move to your schooling, do you remember your first school?
Yes, it was the junior branch of University College School, which was in Holly Hill at the sort of the top of Hampstead Heath, and I suppose about half a mile from our home. But I walked there every morning. And then I was at the senior branch for a year. Still goes strong. yes, the junior school was rebuilt while I was at it, and while it was being rebuilt, we moved into the gym of the upper school in Frognall. And I still keep in touch with them. They send me their annual report, and they had a dinner and celebration there, celebrating the 100th anniversary of their move to Hampstead. They'd originally been at in Gower Street, next door to University College itself, and my father was there as an undergraduate, as a schoolboy, and so was my mother's father. So we have a long connection with the school. But after 1 year, my mother got me moved to Westminster School, where I was for the rest of my schooling. I'd been doing classics, and the first 2 years at Westminster I was doing classics. But it was clear to my mother, yes, I think this was after my father had died, that my serious interests were in science, and against opposition from the headmaster, got me transferred to the science side, and he used the phrase that I was forsaking virtue for pleasure. But I was extremely well taught in physics by J.S. Rudwick, whose son was Martin Rudwick, was a well-known historian of science, and I got in touch with him again when he was an undergraduate at Trinity, and he was then a junior research fellow at Trinity for a time, and now lives in Ely, but comes to Trinity fairly often, so I keep in touch with him.
Were there any other teachers who influenced you a lot at Westminster?
There was a Mr. Claridge who taught French, but I had been taught French by a Mademoiselle Française who gave classes at the home of Sir Thomas Lewis, a famous physician, and this was not at all far from my the home where I was brought up. And I first went to her classes at the age of 6, and then my mother arranged for her to come for an hour a week, teaching French to my brother and myself. And, well, she taught me not only French grammar, but French pronunciation, told me what to do with my tongue in order to make French sounds instead of English sounds. All our vowels are really diphthongs, but as a result I have a fairly good French accent. And in Paris once I was mistaken for a Frenchman from some other part of France. But it's helped me in other languages as well.
What other languages are you
well, I learnt German, and my brother and I had a spring holiday in Salzburg, and I did read quite a lot of history of science in German. And the other language that I did learn at one time, dropped to a rather moderate level, was Japanese.
Gosh.
I was invited to, I was at, there was a physiological congress in 1965 in Tokyo, and before that I'd met a distinguished Japanese biochemist who visited England in 1960 and came to visit Alan Hodgkin, my mentor, and myself at that time. And then he introduced to me one of his students who did a PhD under me, Makoto Endo, whom I've kept up with ever since. And yes, my wife and I went to this Congress in Tokyo in 1965, and this Makoto Endo looked after us and took us to other places in Japan, such as Kyoto, visited a lot of temples.
Did you like Kyoto?
Yes, yes, very
it's
impressive.
Very beautiful.
Yes, impressive and beautiful.
Did you go to Nara, which is just next to Kyoto?
On a later occasion, actually. Yes, I've been to Japan a number of times since, always based on scientific meetings. But I did
learn some Japanese.
Learn enough Japanese. I actually gave a lecture in Japanese.
Good heavens!
At that time, I had not started to learn the real Japanese script, which is composed of Chinese characters borrowed, but they've been borrowed from different dialects of Chinese at different times. So each character is associated with several different pronunciations, and most words consist of two characters, and characters pronounced quite differently according to which Chinese dialect it was borrowed from in this context.
Did you actually learn to write some Japanese, because there's hiragana and katakana as well?
Yes. After coming back, I did settle down to, I learned a fair amount of the two syllabaries,
yes,
hiragana and katakana, not alphabets, but they're syllabaries, because they have about 50 characters, each being a consonant plus a vowel. There's no separate categories for L's and R's, and of course Japanese are notorious for mixing them up. And I did once see in print the word celebration, mistake for celebration. But no, after coming back from Japan, I did, I went to a number of lessons at School of Oriental and African Studies, and got a book to learn Japanese from. One of my daughters had the book and tested me on it, but I've really virtually entirely forgotten it now.
You did it just out of interest? There was no practical reason for learning Japanese?
No, it was interest. It's
an intellectual challenge.
Language. It has some resemblances to English, but it is very different, and of course the writing system is entirely different. But you, of course, each character is made up of component elements, but you recognize the character as a whole in the same way that you recognize an English word as a whole. Yes, I remember reading an article, I think it was in Nature a number of years ago, claiming that we did not read words as a whole, but we read them really letter by letter, and his evidence was reducing the intensity of the light with which you're reading until you could hardly read, And then you did have to read words letter by letter. But I think the fact that we do read a whole word at a time struck me again. I was reading, I used to read aloud to my wife in bed before going to sleep, and at one time I read some of Stephen Runciman's book on the Crusades. And of course it has a large number of place names in it, which were quite unfamiliar to me, and they always brought me up standing. I couldn't read them freely. I had to work them out letter by letter and then pronounce them.
So that's good evidence. This came out of your interest in language the French at school.
Yes, it all helped.
Were there other things at school? At one point you mentioned Salzburg, so that immediately makes one think of music. Were you interested in music at any time?
Yes, and I did learn to play the piano at a rather low level, but it was always at a low level. But when an undergraduate, I played quite a lot of chamber music with friends who played violin, viola, cello, clarinet.
So your piano playing was good enough to play with a small group?
Yes, easy classics was my level.
And are there any classics which you're fonder of than others, or most fond of? Do you have favourite composers?
Well, I think Bach is my favourite, and yes, Schubert comes high. Yes, my eldest daughter, who shares this house with me, well, she had a quite good singing voice, and I used to accompany her singing Schubert songs and one or two Bach songs. And I was fond of Brahms. Yes, Schubert's late string quintet is one of my favourites, and one or two of Beethoven's late quartets.
All German, by chance. Well,
yes.
That's not surprising, since most great composers are German. But when you, I mean, towards the end of Westminster, you are now fully specialising in science.
Yes.
And was it particularly physics or biology?
Yes, I had a little biology. No, I think I did dissect a frog and a rabbit. But my interests at that time were really entirely on the mechanical side. And I came up to Cambridge aiming to specialise in physics and become an engineer. But in the Cambridge system, I had to take, for my first 2 years, I had to take 3 different sciences. Naturally, I took physics and chemistry. And when I was wondering what to do for my 3rd science, I went to stay with a friend whom I'd a few years older than me, who lived not far from us in Hampstead, and whom I got to know as a boy. And this was Ben Delisle Burns. Later became a Fellow of the Royal Society, best known for recording from cells in the cerebral cortex. But he was then doing Part 2 physiology, and he recommended physiology as my 3rd subject on the grounds that even in the first year I would be learning things that were still controversial, unlike physics and chemistry, all cut and dried.
Yes.
So I did pick on it, and I think because I'd come up with a major scholarship in physics, my director of studies thought I didn't need supervisions in physics, and I mostly had supervisions from William Rushton. Is that a name?
Yes, I know
signifies
the name, yes.
to you?
Mm-hmm.
Well, a very interesting person. And I went, yes, he took me on solo supervisions, which is a bit unusual in Cambridge. More usual to have 2 or 3 together. And we got on very well. And
He was a good teacher.
I'm sorry?
He was a very good teacher, was he?
Yes. And very musical. And yes, well, I decided to specialize in physiology for my part 2. And the first Lord Adrian, E.D. Adrian, he became head of the physiology department in 1937, when I was just finishing part 1 of the Tripos. And he told me that if I wanted to make a career in physiology, I ought to become medically qualified, because in those days all teaching posts in physiology went to people with medical qualifications. It's no longer true. So I did register as a medical student, and I had done the necessary physiology to get exemption from the qualifying exam in physiology in the part 1 of the Tripos, but I had not done any anatomy. So I spent my 3rd year doing anatomy, lectures, and 5 parts of the human body that have to be dissected: the head and neck, thorax, abdomen, arm and leg. And of course there are only 3 terms in the year, so I did 1 part in each term and 1 part in the April vacation and 1 part in the summer vacation. And yes, we always did the dissections in groups of 2 or 3, and now in the April vacation, when I went to the medical school at Barts to dissect a thorax, and now somebody whom I had known slightly at Trinity, a contemporary of mine, Andrew Barlow. Do you know any of the Barlows?
Yes, I've heard the name. I think one of them was at King's, I have a feeling. But anyway, yes, I know the name.
Yes.
Horace.
Horace Barlow was at King's. He's now a fellow of Trinity.
Yes.
And I see him regularly.
Mm.
But this was Horace's next elder brother. And, well, we got on very well. Neither of us was very ready with conversation. And then he and I both found ourselves doing part 2 physiology in 1938-39. A very small and very agreeable class of only 12 of us. But in our 3rd year we were both, as I say, doing anatomy, and we did a thorax jointly at Barts.
Who were your teachers? I mean, Lord Adrian you mentioned, was he directly teaching you, or?
Well, he lectured to us in our part 2 class, but before that he was in Cambridge, but he had a Royal Society professorship and not a teaching post. And I never had supervisions from him. As I say, I mostly had supervisions from William Rushton, but in my final year, when doing part 2, I did have supervisions once with Alan Hodgkin.
Did you?
And that was how I first got to know him.
Mm. How much older than you was he?
4 years.
Mm. So it's rather strange being, say, 20 and he was 24, something like that.
Yes.
And did you take to him straight away because you had a long association with him?
Yes, we got on very well, and well, that summer of 1939, he'd made arrangements to go to the Marine Biological Laboratory at Plymouth to do experiments on this very large nerve fibre that squids have. They have a pair of these fibres. And the reason they're large, I mean, speaking evolutionarily, is that the crude way of getting a high velocity of conduction is to have a large diameter. And the speed of conduction goes up with the square root of diameter. And squids need to activate all the muscle of their mantle with which they make this squirt of water with which they propel themselves backwards. They need to activate all this muscle synchronously. So they have this sort of artificially high conduction speed in their nerve fibers in order to do it. So they have this pair of very large nerve fibers which are convenient, very convenient for experimental purposes. They're about 0.5 millimeter across, while the largest fibers in us are only about 1/50th of a millimeter across, and they get their high velocity of conduction by a different trick. The velocity is limited largely by the high electrical capacity of the surface membrane due to it being very thin. It's just a bimolecular layer. And all vertebrates, for their fast conducting fibers, have extra layers of membrane on the outside, so that the membrane is enormously thicker than the actual excitable membrane, and they have to have little gaps in this thick membrane in order to have the actual excitability, which couldn't work through all these membranes in series. And well, this sort of nerve fibre, well, it had been investigated by Japanese Kato in the 1920s, and he dissected out single fibres, and the general feeling in the West was that nobody except Japanese were skilled enough with their hands to dissect single fibres. But an American couple, Ramsey and Street, husband and wife, and I think Sybil Street did teach herself to dissect single fibres, and well, I'd inherited, as I think I said, I'd inherited my mother's ability with her hands. So yes, and then another Swiss, Alex von Murat, had taught himself to dissect single fibres, and his pupil, Robert Stempfli, came to work with me. I think contact was originally because Alan Hodgkin had known von Murat, and from them I learnt the technique of dissecting single nerve fibres, and later on I learnt to dissect single muscle fibres, a good deal more difficult, from muscles of frogs. And all my experimental work has been on single fibers of from frogs, and muscle fibers partly from vertebrates, but also from crabs and lobsters, because their muscle fibers are very much larger in diameter, and all our fast muscles are crossed by what are called striations. And in vertebrates, these striations are separated by only a few wavelengths of light. So it's difficult to get a good image of them. But crabs and lobsters and insects have fibers with very much wider spacing, which can be studied satisfactorily with the ordinary light microscope. There's virtually no absorption of light by the striations, and the ordinary microscope is designed to give a good image for regions that absorb light. But the ordinary light microscope can be used to look at regions of high refractive index, because they act like little lenses, concentrate the light above them. So if you go out of focus upwards, bright regions are regions of high refractive index, and if you focus low, dark regions are regions of high refractive index. And it became customary in the 19th century to use the dark focus position. So what are called the A bands of muscle. They're A for anisotropic, because they affect polarized light in a particular way, but they have a higher refractive index than average, so they're dark when focused down. So they got commonly called the dark bands, though they're not intrinsically dark. But I did a certain amount of work on these invertebrate muscle fibers, but they're not fully excitable in the way that a vertebrate muscle fiber is. A vertebrate muscle fiber is activated by its nerve at a particular region, and the activity spreads along the muscle fiber in very much the same way that it spreads along a nerve fiber. Trying to remember what sequence things happened in.
Well, we got to Alan Hodgkin going down to look at giant squids. It's 1939.
Yes.
So presumably at the end of, more or less the end of your undergraduate degree, the war came.
Yes.
And then what happened? What happened in the war?
Well, first, just what happened at Plymouth.
Okay.
Actually, Alan Hodgkin already had hints from recordings on, well, he'd learned to isolate single nerve fibers from crabs. They have, well, largish nerve fibers, not as large as squid ones, but the same type as squid ones, but they're something like a fifth of a millimetre across, unlike the half millimetre of the squid fibres, but they have only this thin membrane on the surface, so they could conduct at a moderately high speed. And he made a number of well, very important observations on these fibres. And in 1937-38 he was in the United States and met Casey Cole, who was already doing experiments on the giant nerve fibre, which had been discovered by J.Z. Young, professor from Oxford, became Professor of Anatomy at University College London, where I saw quite a lot of him.
Didn't he come to Cambridge later? Young? Was he in...
Young? Not this Young.
No. Sorry, you were...
There are a lot of Youngs.
Yes. So he was at London, yeah.
Yes. But anyhow, in summer of 1939, yes, Hodgkin went to... yes, J.Z. Young had discovered this giant nerve fibre in squids, but had never done anything really significant experimentally. I think he measured its speed of conduction, which was, well, high compared with small diameter fibres. But Hodgkin went to Plymouth to study them and invited me to join him in August. Earlier I'd been on holiday in Scotland, and so I did join him at the very end of July, and between us we managed to get these fibres set up so that we could put an electrode down actually inside them. We had them hanging vertically in a trough of seawater, which has the same composition as their body fluids, and we'd stimulate it at one end and record the impulse as it goes down. And in order to get a good recording, we needed to keep down the resistance of the inside of the tube that we put inside, glass tube drawn out to an outside diameter of 1/10 of a millimetre, a lot smaller inside, and we had to have it filled with a fluid. Well, I think we used seawater again of the same concentration as the squid was accustomed to, but that gave it a rather high resistance, and that, together with the input capacity of the amplifier, would have distorted the action potential. So I threaded a bit of silver wire down inside this glass tube electrode to keep down the resistance. And then a trick that Alan knew was to prevent the silver from becoming polarized by passing current. He passed a current making the silver the positive electrode, which dissolved some of the silver and made a precipitate of silver chloride, very insoluble, on the outside of the silver, so that the silver metal was in contact with a saturated solution of one of its salts, and that made it a non-polarizable electrode. It could pass small but appreciable amounts of current without the voltage being distorted by polarization, it's called. And that enabled us to record the impulse from the inside of the squid fibre without distortion. And when we put it down first, we recorded the resting potential. It was already well known, since the 19th century, that the insides of nerves and muscle fibres are electrically negative to the outside. But the actual value of the negativity was not known. But we found that it was, well, in these damaged fibres, it was about 50 millivolts negative inside. But when we stimulated the fibre at one end and an action potential went past the tip of this electrode, it didn't merely come up toward the potential of the external fluid, which was what all the textbooks told us at the time, but it went very substantially positive. And we published this in a short note in Nature, describing the observation, and but with no discussion and no conclusions.
When was this? When did you
Well,
publish
this
it?
was right at the beginning of the war.
Oh.
I think it was in October '39, and we had no explanation for the for this overshoot, for the inside going actually positive during the impulse. And during the war, Alan Hodgkin and I met and speculated about what the mechanism of this was, and we published a paper, a full-length paper in the Journal of Physiology in 1945, in which we put forward 4 possible explanations, all of which turned out to be wrong. And with hindsight, I was reminded of a thing that my grandfather, T.H. Huxley, said when he first made himself master of the central idea of the origin of species. His response was, "How stupid not to have thought of that." And, well, the explanation for this overshoot is in fact very simple. It was known from beautiful experiments by K.C. Cole before the war, measuring the impedance of the membrane at a range of high frequencies. It was known that the membrane had this very high capacitance, and that the resistance of the membrane fell to a very low value when an impulse went along. It had become permeable to ions. And with hindsight, it was very stupid of us not to realize that this high permeability is in fact specific for sodium ions. Sodium ions are much more concentrated outside the fibre than inside, so they diffuse in during the action potential, carrying their positive charge and making it go positive.
This is meanwhile the war is going on.
Yes.
Because we'll come back to this and your later work with Hodgkin in a minute, but what happened when the war started? I mean, you just finished your degree. Did you stay?
Well, I had registered as a medical student, so the obvious thing, and I had done the necessary qualifying exam, so the obvious thing was to go ahead toward getting qualified. And now at that time, the Regius Professor of Physics at Cambridge, Physic, not physics, was John Ryle. Yes, a very distinguished physician. And he'd been at Guy's Hospital in London, loved teaching and hadn't got anyone to teach. And there were 2 or 3 of us who needed teaching. So he ran an introductory clinical course at the old Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge. That ran for the first 3 months of the war. And yes, I was on this team. I found clinical work very interesting. After that, I moved to University College London and went on with clinical training until teaching stopped because of the bombing of London in June 1940. But meanwhile, in Cambridge, through John Ryle, I was introduced to Robert McCance and Elsie Widdowson. I don't know if you know their names. They were the leading nutritionists at that time.
How do you spell McCance?
M-C-C-A-N-C-E. But they'd got together at King's College London before the war and had produced the first table of calorie values of foods and so on. So the natural thing for them to do at the beginning of the war was to conduct an experiment in rationing. And, well, through John Ryle and being a medical student, I met them and they recruited me as one of their guinea pigs. So for the first 3 months of the war, and in fact for a bit longer, I was on this experimental ration diet. It was like our wartime rations, except that the rations that we had of meat, butter, sugar, milk, were I think about half what we had during the war. And bread and potatoes were not rationed. It was not until after the end of the war that bread and potatoes were rationed. Very difficult to organize because different people's requirements of total calories vary so enormously. I mean, nowadays I think my calorie intake is less than half what it was at that time. But we were weighing everything we ate, and we were weighing ourselves every day, and we were weighing the products of our bowels and having them analysed at regular intervals. And, well, at that time I was taking a lot of vigorous exercise. And then, now in New Year 1940, first winter of the war, McCance took Elsie Widdowson and McCance's own son, then I think aged about 14, and myself, and I think one of the other
Guinea pigs.
Guinea pigs, to the Lake District to take vigorous exercise. McCance was very energetic, and so was I in those days, and we had one marvellous walk. We were staying in Langdale at a house I had stayed in before because it belonged to George Trevelyan, whose wife was a step-cousin of mine, and I'd known the Trevelyans through that connection, very important to me. But we had a marvellous walk, set off at 6 a.m. in the dark, walk of, I think, 37 miles, 7,000 feet up and down, got back at 6 p.m. in the evening. There was snow on the ground, but not a cloud in the sky the whole day. Best walk I've ever had.
Wonderful. And then you all, no doubt, weighed and measured when you got back.
Yes, we were still on these rations, and we were chewing brown bread all the way.
What was the purpose of this holiday, to actually do a scientific experiment or just for fun?
Well, it was checking that we were still in good shape. it wasn't really a scientific experiment, but it was an experiment.
Did you? I don't know how old G.M. Trevelyan was. Did you know him at all?
Yes, I saw a lot of him, both as an undergraduate. He asked me out to lunch many times. So I say the connection was that his wife was a
step cousin.
A step first cousin. But he invited me regularly to his holiday home in Northumberland, and through that I got to know his brother, Sir Charles Trevelyan, who occupied the family house at Wallington, and through that connection, we went shooting on the Wallington grounds, and I got to know the Wallington family, and their youngest son, Geoffrey, is one of my closest friends now.
Lovely. It's just ending there, so...
Oh, yes.